Hello, I'm Toycat, welcome back to my second channel, Geopolitical Videos. Today I wanted to talk about some pretty huge news that I haven't seen covered by many major news outlets, but it is the expansion of the world's largest military alliance. That's right, in blue you see all of the NATO countries, and a brand new country was just added to NATO over the past week. This is pretty huge, especially if you live in one of these blue countries, because now you're obliged to defend a 30th NATO country, and a 30th NATO country is obliged to defend you. But despite that fact happening in just the last 4 days, a lot of you, even if you live in the blue countries, like you probably do, probably couldn't name which new country it is that you are now going to be defending and which is now going to be defending you, right? And this is something that I think is kind of concerning by itself, but let's go ahead and let's dive into it without further ado. Hey, the brand new NATO member is North Macedonia, joining NATO as the 30th ally. By the way, this is straight from the NATO website itself. It's weird to say that NATO has a website, but yeah, NATO/OTAN, which is the French version of North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why is it called that, you ask? I mean, I just can't work out why North Atlantic Treaty for the North Atlantic based defense organization. I can't tell you what the reasoning is, but yeah, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a 30-member bloc, which obviously all is obliged to defend each other. And just fun fact, because every story in the world has some link to the current situation, basically they actually agreed this in February of 2019, but it took quite some time for all the 29 national parliaments to vote to ratify it, because every member gets to agree. The reason they couldn't join for so long was because of Greece, actually, but they couldn't agree for so long because Spain is having a political crisis, so they took the longest to actually do it. So, fun fact, everything in the world right now, even military alliances that are so far removed, are mildly related to current global situation you don't name in YouTube videos. And the other thing you might question is like, oh yeah, so this was a map of NATO I was showing earlier. Isn't this just a map of the EU with Canada and the US? And when you hear it's 30 countries, it adds up as like, oh yeah, 28 EU members, or 27, but like 28 EU members, and then Canada and the US, and then I guess the UK as well. Well, that's what it is, right? Except the interesting thing about NATO is even though it's a military alliance which mostly covers, again, EU plus Canada/America, it's actually very different in terms of its makeup, and the fact that Macedonia is in, or North Macedonia is in NATO, but not inside of the EU should tell you something. But let's let's show you this even better, because you can see how, like, oh yeah, the EU, pretty solid block. There's a big gap in the Balkans, and also Turkey's trying to join but also isn't. Even though when you look at the EU, it's like, oh yeah, these two maps are pretty much the same. You will spot, if you look a little closer, that like, oh yeah, wait a minute, there are 4 EU countries which are in the EU, the economic body, but not inside of NATO, the security body. And then there are lots of European countries which are inside of NATO, but not inside of the EU. And what's the deal with that? And long story short, because like, why is Ireland, Austria, Finland, Sweden inside of the EU, but not inside of NATO? Long story short, to simplify things, is neutrality. Sweden, Finland, Austria, Ireland are all neutral countries. Switzerland as well, but they're so neutral they don't even want to join the EU. And they argue, after the end of the Cold War, Sweden and Finland and Austria all kind of argued like, hey, we're neutral, but now the EU isn't so much to do with military, so we can join that. That's how they can justify being in the trade body, but not the thing. But obviously, joining a big military body of a military alliance is something that's kind of questionable, which means that, yeah, in the Nordics, you have a perfect flip between, or removing Denmark, which is in both, you have Iceland and Norway, which are NATO members, and then you have Sweden and Finland, which are EU members, and they both are in different bodies, which is kind of interesting. Maybe you find that to be fascinating like me. But regardless, Macedonia is the 30th member. This happened on the 27th of March, but the reason I mention this today is because, hey, fun fact, they actually didn't raise the flag until the 30th of March 2020. Guess what? That was about an hour ago. You can watch, even on the official NATO channel, them slowly raising the flag. This is satisfying, right? Like, if I'm not mistaken, it's Brussels, Belgium, because that's where the hub is. They raised their flag, so now there are 30 flags, including, I think you'll find, the North Macedonia one. It's a really slow raise, and, it's not a windy enough day to truly see all of the Macedonian flag. It looks really ugly until it's, like, fully flayed out there. But yeah, here is a thing you can watch if you want to. Watch North Macedonia join the ranks of the Netherlands and Norway and Poland and Portugal. Yes, they're alphabetical. How much effort did it take to move all the flags around? I don't know. Probably not the biggest part of them joining a new organization, but it is something worth mentioning. Also, just as a fun fact, like, since we've got some recommended videos, one, wow, this one here, extremist ideologies explained through Minecraft villagers sounds so weird. But I do recommend this weird video about Know Your Ally Britain. It's like getting Americans to like the UK so they'd be willing to defend it. Weird video that it seems relevant to this situation right here. But anyway, so this is the end of North Macedonia's decades-long ambition to become a NATO member. Literally since their first, since their founding pretty much in the 90s, North Macedonia has wanted to join NATO and has been a part of the Partnership for Peace for a really long time. And basically the only reason they couldn't is because like, hey, as it turns out, Greece doesn't like the the naming system they used to have. They renamed recently, and now they can join NATO. And I almost wanted to have a whole conversation about like, oh yeah, North Macedonia, this country right here, by the way. North Macedonia basically gave up what they thought should be their rightful name of Macedonia in exchange for being able to join NATO, which is now happening, and in exchange for being able to potentially one day join the EU. Both those things are, happening in the stages of going on. North Macedonia is leaving behind the past and joining the West, for better or for worse, right? And, if you think that NATO and the EU are good, would you change your country name in exchange for those things? That's where I wanted to take this as like, yeah, that is interesting, right? Like, they had to change their rightful name. They had to trade off some of their history or whatever else. But in exchange, they get to join the bodies which are much more important. Defense is more important than your country name. In my opinion, economics and having a strong economy more important than your country's name. I would rename my country to the United Uingdom. It's hard to switch a U and a K. I would name it Dumb Things if that meant that I got 10% richer. Is that me being dumb or not? That's a conversation I always wanted to take this into. But instead, how about we talk about the fact that NATO joined the North Macedonia joined NATO. But really, like going back to the map thing, like most people wouldn't be able to spot or really point that out. In fact, the only border this really adds to NATO that is realistically going to be attacked is like against Serbia. And the truth is like NATO can probably take Serbia quite well. In fact, if you actually look at the list of countries by military spending, you can see how like, oh yeah, because everyone always knows the fact that like the US has more military spending than the next like 10 nations combined, but the US has more military spending than again any other nation, as well as all the next 10 combined, etc., as you can see right here. But the other fascinating thing is like if you actually add the US, you add France, NATO member, you add the UK, you add Germany, you add Italy, you add all the other NATO countries, you actually end up at about 60 to 70% of global military spending. So the truth is no country or combination of countries can take down NATO, which means that like, so what does North Macedonia add? And it's like, well, I mean, can't help to add they have 0.1 billion in defense spending. Can we compare that to America real quick? 648 billion, 0.12 billion. Sorry, I should really not round me down. 648 billion, 0.12. I mean, it's literally a rounding error in terms of not only the US alone, but in terms of the alliance. So you might question like, so why do they expand there? And the truth is, this is something that isn't really easy to explain or understand, because most of the expansions in literally since 2004 have been pretty small countries that don't add to the alliance in terms of their necessary contribution by itself. It's nice that they're contributing, and North Macedonia did send their troops into Afghanistan, for example, because the only time that NATO has actually had to use their force, the invocation of Article 5, as it's called, was actually because of 9/11, where again they invaded Afghanistan because the 9/11 terror attacks were arguably like a declaration of war. Although, I mean, you know what? It's kind of weird to go back at this and be like, that's the one time Article 5's been invoked. 9/11. But yeah, the only country in the NATO alliance that has called for the help of all the other ones as like a official matter was the United States of America, which is the largest member, which can handle all these things by itself anyway, right? If they really wanted to. So the question becomes like, so why did all the other 29 countries get together and add North Macedonia? And the simple explanation is usually given as stability for the region. The more countries in Europe that join NATO, one, the less Russia feels like it can take over. Right, if every country was independent and didn't care about each other, it would be really, really easy for Russia to be like, actually, we'd like to take back Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Put up your best fight. I mean, again, you don't need to look at the map to see that, like, oh yeah, those three countries without the economic or military support, they probably would be taken over. But then the question becomes like, okay, so every country that joins NATO is one that Russia can't get to, and then it just seems like it's a very anti-Russia alliance. And it's like, oh. So it's the anti-Russia squad. But even then it's like, but Russia can't realistically take over North Macedonia. And then you go, I guess, like, it's the anti-Serbia and Russia squad too, because, you know, even though Bosnia is trying to join right now, Serbia is not in any stage of joining NATO, so, like, it's the anti-Serbia gang. They're trying to stop Serbia and Russia, the only two, you know, like, powers which are any form of threat to anyone in the region as, like, a form of peace. And the simplest answer is, like, you can't, you know, like, trying to define a giant intergovernmental body like this as, like, having a single goal or a thing like this. The simplest explanation is, like, by spending the money, by having the alliance, it's, you know, it helps the peace exist in its whole. And even though I don't know if I perfectly agree with that, like, we spend a lot of money to buy peace that we already have and that countries enjoy regardless of whether they buy into it or not. It's like a free rider problem on a global issue. The thing is like, oh yeah, the world is actually getting to be a safer place over time. The world is safer and safer. The fact that the only, you know, invocation of Article 5 was in 2001 for a terror attack, you know, the fact that what was the last major war you had to fight in, friends? Wait, actually, are any of you drafted into the military right now? Oh, you don't live in Switzerland, so you, or, you know, South Korea or Thailand or a few other countries that actually force you, you know, into the military. Oh, you don't live in one of those countries. Oh, I guess Israel as well. Huh, isn't that weird how you're not fighting in a war? Because the truth is war has gone down significantly. There just aren't many wars being fought right now. And therefore, the expansion of NATO kind of just comes down to, like, why does it expand and when? Well, it started very clearly as, like, have a big bunch of, you know, countries together that can defend against nuclear Armageddon. And then when nuclear Armageddon went off the table, it's like, well, I mean, a bunch of countries defending against Russia's expansion into Eastern Europe. And even though Russia very much could expand into Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and in fact, Russia literally has expanded into Ukraine. There is still a huge chunk of Ukraine that legally belongs to them, but you know, like, by international law, but by Russia law belongs to Russia, and, you know, I mean, which one matters more, you could argue. The same with Georgia. There are two parts of Georgia still that Russia just went in and invaded and, you know, have supported ever since then. I've had this whole video planned about the borderization in Georgia, where Russia, you know, the Russian-backed separatists of North Ossetia do just keep on moving the borders forwards a little bit every few days. It's hilarious. It sounds like a joke, but it's a real thing happening. Sure, Russia is expanding very slowly in the region. Maybe this is the only thing to stop them. But, like, if there are fewer deaths happening than ever from war, what is the point of a organization like this? And the truth is it's not really very easy to define it. NATO does have a crisis of defining itself all the time, and one of the easiest ways is, like, well, if you get a new member, you defend them, they defend you, you get good feelings all around, you get the peace bonus. That's the simplest way for an organization to stay alive and stay relevant. So why is there a 30th member in NATO? They wanted to join. NATO wants to do some good things for the region, and I guess this achieves both those goals at once. However, just while we're here anyway, to kind of, like, add something into this, I mentioned earlier how there are fewer people dying from war every single year, and this is true actually, but before this video I decided, like, oh yeah, so fewer people dying from war, that's a well-known fact. However, I decided to look into it and, like, oh yeah, if you actually look at it, the number of deaths in terms of, you know, wars, etc., is going down. In terms of conflicts between states, the number of deaths per year is hugely down. I mean, most years there aren't any, you know, there aren't any significant number of deaths from conflicts between states, and there are no, you know, colonial conflicts between a country and its colonial possessions. But the number of civil conflicts is, sadly, staying pretty steady year to year, and sadly what's rising even faster than that is the number of civil conflicts with foreign state intervention. You know, think of the Iraqs of the world, think about the attempted Iran, etc. of the world. This seems to be where the world is actually going, and the sad thing about this is this isn't something that can be backed by NATO. You know, this is why, you know, the separatists in North Ossetia or the separatists in Abkhazia, you know, the two parts of Georgia that right now have their own little borders, because again, what is Georgia? Is it all of this or is it just some of this? No one knows for sure. But, like, when these are inside of a state, the rules are a bit more fuzzy and hazy, and maybe we should just be happy that, like, oh yeah, countries don't fight each other anymore, they fight themselves. Or maybe that's a terrifying thing. I don't know for sure, but I just wanted to tell you, hey, you live inside of a bloc that just got bigger this week, and also, hey, the EU is not a military. A lot of people always say the EU is a, you know, like a thing that has stopped wars. The truth is NATO is the thing that stopped wars, and the EU and NATO have this weird relationship where obviously the EU doesn't include the US and Canada, and, you know, NATO includes a few extra countries like Turkey. It's this weird mishmash situation where, like, in Europe, bodies and organizations get very confusing very fast. And what does any of this mean? It means what you want to. The fact that all of this is open for interpretation, the fact that you can't nail down why is North Macedonia in NATO beyond they wanted to be and everyone else apparently wanted that too. It's kind of interesting to me, but maybe you found this video fascinating. Because I want to just throw the question back out to you. Why do you think North Macedonia joining NATO is a thing NATO wants? Do you think it's good that you're now obliged to defend an extra country and that extra country is going to help out you? I mean, again, it's pretty clear this 1% of North Macedonia's GDP is going to really add to the pile, I reckon. Am I being mean to North Macedonia? Let me know. Comments down below. But for now, thank you for watching this thing. But as always, second channel, don't care too much. Goodbye.